Let there be light. Good morning. How are you guys? Good morning. It's wonderful to see all of you today. Somebody needs to tell Seth that you're not allowed to chop down your redwood. That people are not happy about that kind of thing. Today we start a brand new series, and that is called Shape. And really what we're going to be doing is looking at the life of Jacob over the next couple of weeks, the next 2 weeks after this, really. And each of these sermons will build on one another as we see all that God used, both the brokenness, but also the successes in Jacob's life to shape him into the man that will one day be called Israel. It's a really powerful story. But today as we begin, I want to begin with a story. So I was standing in my kitchen with having a conversation with my wife, and my youngest daughter is 2 years old, and all of a sudden, what we begin to hear, and if you're a parent, you've heard something like this, out of the background is this: excuse me, excuse me, excuse me, just over and over. We taught her not to say mom, 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 but apparently that's better. So she does that, and so finally you get to that breaking point where you go, yes, you pause your conversation and you look over, yes, and then she says this, my 2-year-old daughter. She says, look at my dance, Dad. And she starts to kind of like shake her body and twirl around and all this stuff. She spins in circles to where she gets so dizzy that she falls on the ground, and then she rolls over and her head pops up and she looks at me with kind of this longing expectation, waiting to see what my response will be. And I looked at her and I said, wow, that's some crazy dancing, good job. And then I turn and I try to continue the conversation with my wife. But I don't get 2 seconds into it before all of a sudden I hear, hey, Dad, look at me. Dad, look at me. Look at me. And I look back over and she starts dancing again. And now she's flailing her body all around again. She falls on the ground. She rolls over, looks up at me. Same expectation, same look. And I say, wow, that was really good dancing. Good job. Which I guess I lied and should have to think about that. But, it was what it was. My oldest daughter's in the next room, and she hears her and goes running in and says, Dad, look at what I could do. Look at my dance. And she starts twirling around like a ballerina, kind of thing. And wow, you've gotten a lot better dancing. That's really good. And then the youngest steps in front of her and says, look at me. And this never really ends. They both start kind of yelling, look at me, and they keep stepping one in front of the other one, trying to show us this dance. And what they're hoping for is that either myself or my wife will finally look at them and, applaud their next performance. And it's innocent, it's cute, it's sweet and fun, and I get all that. What they're wanting out of this moment is to be seen, to be recognized, to be appreciated, to be celebrated, to feel special. What they're really wanting from this is to feel significant. And I think the truth is we all do, don't we? I think every human being has a longing for significance. We all, in some way or another, want to know that someone sees us, to be celebrated, to be accepted, to be embraced, seen in this way. We all have a longing for significance. And so, like my daughters, we still dance. We do. We dance with our very lives. And we move in step, twirling our way through accomplishments and promotions and achievements and even money and possession, all of these things as if to declare to the world around us, look at me, with one loud voice. And it never fails that with each passing achievement, with each success, with each promotion, with each material possession that we hold in our hands, it's like we then look up, holding this in our hand, looking up to survey the people who are viewing our lives as if to say, what will their response be? And the question that we all ask ourselves is this: does anyone really see us? Does anybody see us? We all have a longing for significance. I talked to a high school boy a while ago that it was report card time, and he worked so hard that semester to get good grades and to pull this thing off. And did. It was report card day, and he had straight A's. And he comes to me excited. He hasn't even been home yet. And he goes to celebrate that with him. He goes home and he gives that to his mom and his dad because there's parents that care deeply about this. Hands it to them, and the dad looks at it and he says this: so what happened with that A-? Yeah, and it's like the air gets sucked out of the room. You see, that boy had danced, and nobody had seen. There's a woman in her mid-40s that, she's got a good marriage. It hasn't always been easy. She's had to work at it, and has worked really hard. She has 3 kids, and has invested her time, her energy, so much of her life into raising them in the right way, into becoming responsible young people, and they are. And it's great. At times, even under financial stress, she's gone out and got a part-time job to alleviate a part of that burden. And yet, inevitably, the holidays come where she spends time with, goes home, spends time with her parents. And she's always reminded of the career she never had, of the potential she never lived up to, of what she should have been but isn't because of the life she's chosen. And there's a part of her that danced and nobody saw. We all have a longing for significance. On perhaps its deepest of levels, we have a deep longing to be loved. In Genesis chapter 25, we read of a woman named Rebecca. She's married to a man named Isaac, who's the son of Abraham, one of the great patriarchs, or the great patriarch of the Hebrew nation. And there comes this time where Rebecca is pregnant with twins. And the moment arrives where the twins are to be born, and I imagine the parents are excited, and as the first child emerges and is born, they name him Esau, and he is the firstborn. And that was so significant in this culture, because the firstborn carries the weight of the family in some regards. They have both birthright and blessing. They carry the promise and the wealth and the power, all that goes with that family. And they named him Esau. The second child comes in. He's not far behind the first. They're twins, obviously. He emerges clutching his brother's heel, and they name him Jacob. And that name quite literally means he who rides on the heels of another. And I think that was somewhat of a foreshadow of Jacob's life, something that he lived out of. We see it even in Genesis chapter 25, verse 27. It says, when the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man, dwelling in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. And so you have a story of two sons, one who's firstborn, born innately with all of this significance, with all of this promise, and then the second, who's named he who clutches the heels of another, who rides on the heels of another. And what you have is you have one brother who's loved by his father, and then you have another brother who longs to be. You have a brother who lives Jacob, who lives in his brother Esau's shadow, longing to be seen, dancing and longing to be seen by his father, but his father never really looks. So Jacob lives out of this, and he begins to dance with his very life. He never stops dancing, but it doesn't matter because Isaac never really sees. Well, if you're Jacob and you have that longing, much like every single one of us does, right? That longing for significance, that longing in the deepest kind of love, and to have that from someone in this way. If you long for that and he wants it from his father, but he just can't get it because he's never seen, what do you do? Well, you start to look at Esau, but you don't possess the qualities or characteristics that made Esau lovable by his dad in the first place. And so maybe you start to think, well, if I just had what Esau had, if I just had what he had, maybe then I'd be seen, maybe then I'd be okay. And so Jacob begins a series of things that are really out of brokenness, where he tries to take what Esau has. He actually steals Esau's birthright through a moment of coercion, a moment of manipulation, takes that from him. Esau gives it up, but it's in a really inopportune time where a brother takes advantage of a brother, and now Jacob has half of what Esau had. And I wonder if he held that in his hand and wondered, now I have part of what it means to be the firstborn. I have the birthright. It's been given to me. And I wonder if he thought, now my father will listen to me. Now my father will finally see me. I don't have to dance any longer. But it never really happens. We know this because time continues on. And eventually Isaac is old. And it says that his eyesight's beginning to fail and he can't really see anymore. And he starts to ponder death when he realizes, his time is coming. And so he goes to his firstborn son, Esau, and says, Esau, I'm getting old and I want to give you the blessing. That's rightfully yours as my firstborn son, the son whom I love. I want to give this to you. And so first go and hunt some game and cook that for me and prepare it, and then I will come back and bless you. And while Esau is gone, out, hunting and doing what Esau does, that Isaac loves so much, Rebekah hears about all of this. And even she gets in on this, trying to help Jacob achieve the love of his father, achieve that hunger, that longing for acceptance that he has, that we all have. She says, your father's going to bless your brother, so here's what we'll do. Pretend to be Esau, and then he'll bless you. You'll have this. You'll get Esau's blessing. And so she dresses Jacob up like Esau, so much so that she puts fur on the back of his hands and on his neck. And Esau is ushered into his father's room. He's not a child at this moment. He's a man, still living out of this. Ushered into his father's room, walks in, and his dad can't see who's there. And so Jacob walks over to the bed, pretending to be Esau. And his dad says, who's there? And he reaches out and he feels the back of his hands and he feels his neck. Apparently Esau was really hairy, like in a weird way. And he says, is that really you, Esau? Is that really you? How sad must it have been for Jacob in this moment. I'm sure everything in him wanted to say, no, Dad, it's me, Jacob, and I just want to be seen by you. But he says, yes, it's me. He lies to his dad. And his dad gives him the blessing, gives him his brother's blessing. Everything that Esau was entitled to as a firstborn, both birthright and blessing, have now been taken by Jacob. One through manipulation and coercion, the other through cheating, stealing, deceiving. And this is really tragic. It's just sad. You have Jacob, who so longs to be seen, to be chosen by his father, that he's willing to pretend to be his brother, the one whom Isaac really loves, just to feel what it's like, just to have it. But when we live out of our brokenness, it only ends up creating more brokenness. Often the very thing we hate about ourselves, we tend to create in others. And so Esau comes back from the hunt, and he encounters his father, and quickly the two of them realize that something had happened, and that what Jacob had done. And Esau is enraged, and I imagine Isaac was frustrated and embarrassed too. And we read about it in Genesis chapter 27. Verse 34, it says, as soon as Esau heard the words of his father, he cried out with an exceedingly great and bitter cry, and said to his father, bless me, even me also, O my father. And you hear Esau suddenly longing for significance himself. Remember, our brokenness, when we live out of it, only creates more. But he, Isaac, said, your brother came deceitfully, and he has taken away your blessing. In the Hebrew, it reads quite literally, your brother came as a deceiver and stole this from you. And this is what happens. And suddenly, Jacob, who so longs to be seen, who's been dancing his whole life, hoping that his dad will one day recognize this, and his dad will see him, craving that answer to that longing for significance within him, that longing that we all have. Now he's cast out. He has to leave the house. And the reason why is because Esau hates him and wants to kill him. And his mom and dad say, look, essentially, you got to get out of here until your brother can calm down. Because he's going to murder you. And so they send him away to go in search of the land of his uncle, a man named Laban. What's so sad is if you're Jacob, the boy who danced that nobody saw, and what you're longing for is to finally be seen by your father. You know the worst thing in the world is to be sent away because he can't see you anymore. So Jacob goes wandering. In this time, he has a dream. He goes to bed one night, and God appears to him in a dream. And there's a ladder with angels ascending and descending. And I believe Seth talked on this a little bit ago. But what the significance, what ultimately happens in this dream, is God goes to Jacob, and he appears to him and says, I am the God of the universe, and I'm the God of your father, and I'm the God of your grandfather, and I want to be your God. He looks at Jacob and says, I choose you. And I want to bless you, Jacob. Your descendants will be as numerous as the dust of the earth. And furthermore, from your descendants, the entire world will be blessed. That I am going to reveal myself. I'm going to bless the whole world through you, Jacob. You have significance. I choose you. And God says, I will be with you. I'm not going anywhere. Now you would think that in this moment, it is like breath into Jacob's very soul. You would think for the boy who danced that nobody ever saw, for the boy who longs for the love of his father, just to be seen by him so that he can finally have an answer to that inner longing for significance that we all have. This boy, you would think that this would be life-giving, that the God of the universe, the most powerful being, chooses him. And you realize God gave him his blessing freely. He didn't have to pretend to be anybody. God said, I see you, Jacob, and I want to bless you. You would think this would be amazing, and yet Jacob misses it entirely. He recognizes that this place is spiritual. He recognizes that this is a holy place and that this is probably God. But you see, here's a truth that even plays out in our own life. Sometimes we miss the beauty of the present that exists right here before us because we are so tied to the brokenness of our past. And Jacob misses it. We read this because here's how Jacob responds to God. I mean, he says, surely, you are God. But then verse 20, Jacob made a vow to God saying, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, meaning this, if God will take care of my basic, elements, sustain me and provide for me in this, and now wait for this, because he's going to say, so that, more or less, in order that. And so if he'll do all of that, because here's what my goal is, here's the thing I really long for here, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. And it's as though God looks at it, it's as though Jacob says, God, I believe that you're powerful and I believe that you're God, but if you'll protect me, I have this mission, this thing, I have been dancing my whole life, longing to be seen by my father, and I'm not done dancing yet. I'm not done with this yet. And so if you'll just allow me to go home so I can continue this moment, so that I can finally be seen, then if you give me the longing in my heart, then you will be my God. And it's like Jacob missed the significance of the moment entirely. It could have been a game changer, and yet he's too stuck in the brokenness of his past to see the beauty of the now. And so he continues forward on his journey. Eventually he comes to his uncle's land, a man named Laban. Laban rushes out to greet him and takes Jacob in, but he realizes that Jacob's kind of, destitute, that he's more of a runaway. He's seeking shelter with him, and so rather than treating him like royalty, Laban puts Jacob to work. And Jacob works for Laban for about a month. And finally Laban comes to him, and I think he has a plan that we're going to see kind of lived out all along, but he comes to him and says, Jacob, you're my kin, essentially. What is it that you want? And we read this in chapter 29, beginning at verse 15. Then Laban said to Jacob, because you are my kinsman, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what shall your wages be? Now Laban had 2 daughters, and the name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. And Leah's eyes were weak, but Rachel was beautiful in form and appearance. Jacob loved Rachel. And he said, I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel. And Laban said, it is better that I give her to you than that I should give her to any other man. Stay with me. This is fascinating. It is. This moment is fascinating. And here's why. Jacob is only supposed to be gone for just a little bit until his brother's anger kindles down and he returns home. And ultimately we know that's what Jacob longs for, to go back home to his father's house. And Laban says, what is it that you want? And between that question and Jacob's reply are these 2 verses. And they're so significant. It says this, that Laban had 2 daughters. One was named Rachel, she's the younger. One's named Leah, she's the older. And that Rachel is beautiful in form and appearance. Rachel is attractive. She is sexually attractive, appealing. People wanted Rachel. She is that person. She's the one that everyone wants. And then juxtaposed with the description of Rachel, you have the description of Leah. And it says that, something essentially was wrong with her eyes. And we don't know exactly what that meant. She could have had a birth defect. She could have had, something wrong with her. But we have no clue. But you can see very clearly within the sentence itself, what's being done here is you have a compare and contrast that's going on. You have Rachel, the beautiful one, the one that everyone loves, the one that everyone wants, the one who is, attracted and chosen, and you have Leah, the ugly one, the one that no one sees, the one that no one wants. And you have these 2 sisters, and so who does Jacob see? Of course, Rachel. Jacob loved Rachel. He sees what basically everybody else in the day probably saw. He loved Rachel. And I'm going to argue that word love there is soft. It's not just that, he was attracted to her. He loved her. He cared about her. He is I'm going to argue, he's a man obsessed. He's a man consumed. And we're going to see this play out in just a moment. Rachel becomes something significant for him. He must have Rachel. Like I said, he's a man consumed, a man obsessed. Well, why? Why would I say that? Well, 2 reasons. One, Laban goes to him and says, what would you want? He says, give me Rachel for my wife, and I will work 7 years for you, or for her. 7 years is what I'm willing to work. Now you have to understand, in that culture, the groom paid a bride price when he wanted to get engaged, to the bride's parents. And the average bride price would have been something around 50 shekels. That would have been really good, actually, to receive that. That was a fair and good offer as far as that goes. And the average day laborer in that era made a shekel and a half a day. So when Jacob says, I'm willing to work 7 years in order to be with Rachel, he is literally saying, I'm willing to pay 2.5 times what would have been really good. I'm willing to pay something extravagant. I'm willing to do the ridiculous. I will do anything to be with Rachel if I could just have her. Furthermore, think about a chapter ago when God came to Jacob and said, I want to be your God and I choose you and I'm going to bless you and do great things through you. This is this amazing moment. And Jacob says, sorry, but first get me back home to my father's house. That's what I long for. I'm not done dancing yet. If you could just take me back there, I want to be seen. Because I have a deep longing for significance. That's what's coming out of this. And now, here we find ourselves a chapter later with Laban, and he says, I'm willing to work 7 years, meaning he's forgotten about going home. It's not just a few days. It's not even on the radar. He just wants Rachel, and he's willing to do something ridiculous, something so over the top, something extravagant just to have her. He has to have Rachel. And the reason why is because all of that longing for significance that he had placed upon his father, he then transfers over to her. She's an obsession. She's a longing of his heart, because if he could just have Rachel, maybe then. And we feel this way at times, don't we? We all have this inner longing for significance, and at times there's been somebody that we just want to be seen by, and then for a lot of us, the inevitable experience is we encounter romantic love at some point in time. And you see young people get married, and it's like they quote Jerry Maguire, you complete me, and then a few years down the road, they're like, sort of, and then a few years after that, not really at all. That's how it feels. We put everything on that relationship. If we could just be with that person, then finally find what we're looking for. And so the story continues. And I know you've probably heard this taught is, this is a really romantic thing. And ladies, you need to find a guy who's willing to work for 7 years for you. And that's amazing. And I know that sounds romantic, but that's not here. So, verse 20, Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of the love he had for her. Right? Romantic. Man, that's a guy right there. And if your heart is suddenly swelling up with emotion, allow me to crush it. Verse 21. Then Jacob said to Laban, he's done working for those 7 years, and he goes to Rachel's dad. Rachel's dad, you need to understand this, and said to Laban, give me my wife that I may go into her, for my time is completed. Paraphrase, I have worked for your daughter, I have bought her, and now I want to have sex with her. Give her to me. Whew, that is romantic. He's a man obsessed. He's a man consumed. He must have Rachel. So much so that he doesn't even have a proper wedding. Verse 22. So Laban gathered together all the people of the place, and he made a feast. He didn't send for Jacob's family. He didn't send for Jacob's mother and, all their kinsmen or whatever you call them at that time. Instead, they just gather all the people in the place together, and Laban hosts a feast. Let's make do with what we have here today, and we'll pull this thing off. Why? Because Jacob has to have Rachel, and he wants her now. He's worked his 7 years. Verse 23. But in the evening, he, meaning Laban, took his daughter Leah, not Rachel, Leah, and brought her to Jacob, and he went into her. Verse 25. And in the morning, behold, it was Leah. So you have a wedding, kind of even makeshift wedding, last minute thing that occurs because he has to have her. And then you, like custom would have been in that day, you have a bunch of drinking throughout the day, and at night you have a culture without electricity, and suddenly you have Jacob waiting for his bride in a dark tent, and Laban pushes Leah kind of through the door is the expression that we kind of see here. And suddenly Leah stands there in a dark tent, and Jacob, in such a tragic way, goes to bed with who he thinks is Rachel. And in the morning, behold, it's Leah. This is sad for two reasons. One, because of all that Jacob had worked for, and he'd been deceived, and I get all that. But two, have you thought about Leah in this moment? The girl that nobody sees. Much like Jacob, actually, the girl that no one chooses. The girl who lives in her sister's shadow. This is now her wedding night, her real wedding night. And in order to satisfy that longing for significance, just to feel what it's like to be chosen, just to feel what it's like even to be loved in that moment, she is willing to pretend to be her sister just to experience that. It's really sad, isn't it? It's not even her. She just wants to know what it feels like. The story is really broken. Jacob wakes up the next morning and he's irate, obviously. He is so frustrated. In the morning, behold, it was Leah. And Jacob said to Laban, what is this you have done to me? I imagine he flew the tent door open and runs and finds Laban. What were you thinking? What have you done to me? And then he says this, did I not serve with you for Rachel? Why then have you deceived me? He looks at his uncle and says, why have you entered into this as a deceiver? And I imagine in that moment, Jacob started to come undone in who he was. I think he actually probably started to unravel a little bit as a person, but not for the reason that you're thinking. You see, when Jacob looks at Laban and says, why have you deceived me? He uses the same verbiage and the same phrasing that his father Isaac had used to describe him when he saw Esau's blessing. You see, Jacob walked into a room with a man who could not see, pretending to be his brother, longing to feel what it's like to be chosen, to be blessed, to be significant. And Leah walked into a tent in the middle of the night where she couldn't be seen, pretending to be her sister, longing to be chosen, longing to be significant. And suddenly the deceiver has been deceived. And I think Jacob looked at the situation and saw himself in it, and I think he started to unravel. I think it was like a knife to his heart, that it started to just kind of be an open wound. And if that didn't finish him off, the next moment did. This next comment would have had so much power over Jacob. It would have cut him to his core and brought him to his knees. Verse 26, remember Jacob says, "Why have you deceived me?" Laban said, "It is not so done in our country to give the younger before the firstborn." Or paraphrase, and really more literally, around here, we don't give preference to the younger over the firstborn, Jacob. Around here, you can't just work your way, manipulate your way, cheat your way, lie, steal, do whatever you have to do to try to answer that longing, that hunger for significance that's within you. It doesn't work that way, Jacob. And I think he is undone. Like a knife to the heart, he is wounded in the deepest part of who he is. I mean, I believe this because he doesn't contest it. There's no moment where Jacob says, but you don't understand, and but he doesn't fight for something else. Instead, Laban looks at him and says, look, you can marry Leah this week, and then next week you can marry Rachel. You can have them both 2 weeks apart, but you're going to work another 7 years for me after that. That's how this whole thing is going to unfold. So another 7 years, a more ridiculous request, a more extravagant request, even beyond this. Jacob should have said, you are out of your mind. There's no way. And he says nothing. In the narrative, he just does it. I think he's undone. You see, this is the way that Jacob comes to marry two sisters. Isn't it sad? I mean, it's really a broken story, isn't it? So what do we do with this? What do we do with this grand narrative that's been playing out in their lives? What does this mean for us? Is this just a sad tale that we're supposed to just have some remorse over? What does it mean for us? And I want to argue that this whole thing is declaring something to us in this room right now. And I'm going to say that to you. And it's this: there is no human being strong enough to carry the weight of your longing for significance. There is no human being strong enough to carry the weight of your longing for significance. Imagine if Isaac had pulled Jacob in and said, pulled him in and given him a hug and said, I love you, son, and I want to bless you in different ways, but I appreciate you and I value you, and you're my son. And, in that moment, there would have been some healing and something good would have happened, but ultimately it would not have answered the longing in the deepest part of who Jacob was that craved significance. It wouldn't have been enough in the deepest kind of love. It would have missed eventually. You see, your parents, some of you had great parents, and some of you flat out had terrible parents. Some of you danced your whole life and were never seen. Some of you were reminded of all that you were supposed to be, but weren't, and you have been working and striving. Even the best of parents, though, would not be strong enough to carry the weight of your longing for significance. They'll love you, and they try, but even they will try. Rachel could have been the one to enter that tent that night. Or Jacob could have looked at Leah and said, it's Leah, but I choose you and I love you. That moment could have occurred, and sure, maybe they'd have had a happy marriage, or maybe some things would have been good, at least for a little bit. But in the end, I promise, not Rachel. Rachel wasn't big enough or strong enough to carry the weight of his significance. In the end, Jacob still would have been left with the longing that existed so deep within him, not knowing what to do with it, not knowing where to find it, still hungry as ever. You see, your spouse isn't strong enough to carry the weight of your significance, of the deepest part of you that longs to be loved. Your significant other, the person you're dating, there is no human being out there that can carry it. Eventually you get tired and you drop it. This is what happened even in my own marriage. See, 2 years into marriage, we got a phone call in the middle of the night. I found out that my wife's dad had passed away. It was so unexpected, so sudden. It was like getting punched in the stomach, for the both of us. And Amber, my wife, went into kind of this deep state of grieving. It was so complicated, so personal. She journeyed through this over the course of the next year. I I'd see her, and I got this impression, she was looking at me, wanting me to see her, like really see her. And we had entrusted our significance to one another. We were young and married, and that's what you do. That's just kind of how it seems to happen. We'd entrusted this to one another. And so she wanted me to see her, but it's like no matter how hard I strained my eyes, no matter how hard I fixed my gaze, I could never see far enough. I could just see part of her, but I couldn't see the depths of where she was. Nobody could. And so I was standing there trying to hold her significance, trying to be this for her, and I just kept dropping it. It just became too heavy to carry. And finally, after about a year, my wife, and more wisdom than I think she will ever know she possesses, comes to me and says, Ryan, I think I've been looking to you to provide something for me that only God can. And I nodded my head in agreement, but I didn't know what she was talking about. It took me years to learn that in my own life. This is what happens in Leah's marriage with Jacob. She says this, maybe now Jacob will love me. And the reason why is because God blesses her and allows her to start having children, and she is carrying Jacob's firstborn son. Remember the significance of a firstborn. This is a big deal. Maybe now Jacob will love me. Maybe now this will happen. And she names the child, and consequently each child after that, out of a characteristic that she ultimately longs to receive from Jacob. Here's what happens. She names the first child Reuben, which means to see. As if to say, maybe now Jacob will finally see me. She names the second child Simeon. She has another son. She says, maybe now Jacob will love me. Names him Simeon, which means to be heard. Maybe now Jacob will finally hear me. But he doesn't. And she has Levi, the third child, which means to be attached. As if to say, maybe now my husband will finally be attached to me, but he isn't. And Leah has entrusted all of her significance, the longing for significance that she has, on Jacob. And he's not barely strong enough to carry himself. He just drops it left and right. And she's broken by this again and again, because she's like you, like me, like what we experience. She longs and she's craving an answer, and she thinks it's going to be him. And then finally, she comes to have a fourth child, and this is where the moment of redemption, the moment of great beauty that shines in this narrative comes from. And it's so amazing. And the person who's redeemed in here isn't Jacob. We've unfolded his story, and that story will continue in the weeks to come as it's unpacked in the next 2 weeks. Surprisingly, the place that we find redemption from, beauty from, in this moment is with Leah. Because suddenly she has her fourth child, and this time something is different. This time something has changed. This time as the child is born, she says, I will name him Judah, which means to praise. And it says, and this time she praised the Lord. And what had happened here was the girl that nobody saw, the girl that had been overlooked, the girl that nobody really cared about, that was constantly living in the shadow of her sister, who was stuck in a marriage where she was longing, hungering for significance, and hoping to find that fulfilled in Jacob, and just couldn't. This girl who kept hitting a dead end again and again, hoping to finally be seen, stands there and says, I don't have to dance to be seen anymore, but rather there is a God who chooses me. There is a God who loves me. There is a God who blesses me. There is a God who has seen me all along, and so I don't dance to be seen. I dance because I am seen. And she lifts up her voice and she praises God and says, this time it's different. This time I shall praise him. And for the first time in her life, she entrusted the weight of her longing for significance into the hands of a God who is strong enough to carry her, and her whole life is changed. And that's beautiful. It's amazing. And it's amazing because we're just like her. Every one of us has a deep longing for significance. There's some of you that have spent your life dancing for the approval of someone else. There's some of you that even as adults are still living the way you lived as a child, hoping that one day that parent, that person, that spouse will finally see you so that you can finally have the love and significance that you so long for. There are some of us in this room that our whole lives have been made about being keenly aware of what we're not or what we should be. And so we have lived loud, trying to prove to every person around us, look at me, that one day people will finally see that we're worth it, that there's significance there. And we have lived that way. The reason why I love Leah's moment, this redemptive moment in this story, is because you don't have to dance to be seen. There is a God who has seen you all along. There is a God who chooses you. There is a God who loves you. And we talk about worth. We talk about significance. You know, Jacob worked for 7 years, which was extravagant, ridiculous. Remember, we called him a man obsessed just to have Rachel. God thinks that you are worth Jesus. God sent his son into this world to live among us, to give us hope, so that we can identify with him and to know him. And he died to take all of our brokenness and all of our pain and all of this longing within us, and he rises again to make us new, so that we don't have to dance with our very lives anymore, but rather God sees us, God hears us, he chooses us. And when he looks at you, the price that you're worth, the value that you have is literally Jesus. It is extravagant and ridiculous, like a man obsessed. And he declares that he wants to be with you. You don't have to dance to be seen. Instead, you are freed up to praise as if for the first time ever, because there is a God who has seen you all along. And that is powerful. That will change your life. So this morning, I want to close in worship. And sing a song, and the chorus of the song says again and again, I will bring praise. And I'm going to challenge you, don't stand up and sing to be heard. Don't stand up and sing to be seen. But because the most loving, gracious, powerful being in the universe loves you, sees you, chooses you, may you stand, and may this time be different. May you truly bring praise. God loves you. Now, you see it. Let's all stand together and sing.